The temperature display on Henry's satellite communicator flashed a number he had only seen in documentaries and scientific reports. -50°C. Even standing still for a few minutes without proper protection could become dangerous. Yet that exact number was the reason he had traveled thousands of kilometers to reach the remote northern plateau. He was a travel writer who had spent years chasing unusual experiences around the world. He had crossed deserts under burning suns. He had sailed through storms in the North Atlantic. He had slept in mountain huts above the clouds. But nothing in his career had prepared him for the silence of a landscape frozen to such an extreme. The sun hovered low above the horizon despite the early afternoon hour. Pale golden light stretched across endless fields of snow. The air felt almost solid. Every breath produced a cloud of crystals that sparkled briefly before disappearing into the still atmosphere. There was no wind. No birds. No distant engines. No signs of human life. The silence was so complete that Henry could hear the faint crunch of his boots through multiple layers of insulation. His destination was a flat area beside a frozen lake. Satellite images had shown that the location remained relatively stable throughout winter. After pulling his sled another kilometer, he finally reached the spot and stopped. He stood motionless for a moment, studying the endless white horizon. It felt like standing on another planet. Henry checked his watch. He had only a few hours before darkness settled over the region. At these temperatures, simple tasks required careful planning. Removing a glove for even a minute could become a mistake. Forgetting to secure a zipper could lead to lost body heat. Every action needed purpose. He began assembling his four-season expedition tent. The poles were specially designed to remain flexible in extreme cold. Even so, they resisted his efforts. His thick gloves made every movement slower. The fabric crackled sharply as he unfolded it. Within 40 minutes, a bright orange shelter stood against the white landscape like a small beacon of determination. A feeling of satisfaction spread through him. The tent looked tiny against the vast wilderness, yet it represented safety. It represented preparation. It represented the accumulated knowledge of countless explorers who had faced similar conditions before him. After anchoring every line securely, Henry crawled inside. The difference was immediate. The temperature remained brutally cold, but the tent blocked exposure to the open environment. He unrolled an insulated sleeping pad and positioned his cold-weather sleeping bag on top. Every item had been tested for conditions below -50. Next came the routine that would define the entire expedition. He organized equipment into specific locations. Food near the entrance. Emergency supplies beside his sleeping bag. Batteries inside insulated pouches. Water bottles upside down to prevent freezing at the top. Each detail mattered. As darkness slowly arrived, the frozen lake outside transformed into a silver plain under the fading sky. Henry heated a simple meal using a compact stove. Steam filled the tent briefly before vanishing into the cold air. The warmth felt luxurious despite lasting only a few minutes. While eating, he recorded voice notes for his future article. He described the silence. The cold. The strange beauty of a world where survival depended on discipline rather than strength. He admitted feeling nervous. He also admitted feeling excited. Outside, the first stars appeared. They seemed brighter than any he had seen before. The atmosphere was crystal clear. Thousands of lights covered the sky from horizon to horizon. Henry switched off his headlamp and sat quietly. The darkness beyond the tent walls felt immense. Yet instead of fear, he felt curiosity. For 10 days he would live here. 10 days surrounded by ice, snow, and temperatures capable of freezing exposed skin in minutes. The adventure had officially begun. As he zipped himself into the sleeping bag and listened to the distant cracking sounds of shifting ice beneath the frozen lake, Henry realized something important. He had come searching for an extreme environment. What he might discover instead was something about himself. Henry awoke before sunrise, although sunrise was hardly the correct word for what happened this far north during winter. A faint band of blue appeared along the horizon and slowly brightened the landscape without ever allowing the sun to climb very high into the sky. Inside the sleeping bag he remained surprisingly comfortable. The air within the tent, however, was so cold that each breath created tiny crystals that settled on the fabric walls. Overnight, a thin layer of frost had formed across nearly every surface. He checked the thermometer hanging near the entrance. -52 degrees Celsius. Even colder than the previous day. For several minutes he stayed still and listened. The silence remained absolute. No wind touched the tent. No movement disturbed the frozen lake outside. The wilderness seemed suspended in time. Eventually he forced himself to begin the morning routine. Everything took longer in such temperatures. He carefully changed into fresh thermal layers while keeping exposed skin covered as much as possible. The simple act of putting on boots required patience because the materials had stiffened during the night. Even zippers felt reluctant to move. Once fully dressed, he prepared breakfast. Melting snow for water became the first task of every day. The stove produced a small circle of warmth inside the tent. Henry watched chunks of snow gradually transform into liquid. It was fascinating how something that seemed limitless outside became precious once converted into drinkable water. While waiting, he reviewed notes for the article he intended to write after returning home. He wanted more than a simple survival story. Many people imagined extreme cold as a battle against nature. Yet after only one night, he already sensed a different reality. Nature was not fighting him. The environment simply existed according to its own rules. Success depended on understanding those rules rather than resisting them. After breakfast he stepped outside. The cold struck instantly. Even with specialized clothing, he felt its presence. The air carried a sharpness unlike anything found in ordinary winter conditions. His eyelashes gathered tiny crystals within moments. Each inhalation reminded him exactly where he was. Yet the view made every discomfort worthwhile. The frozen lake stretched endlessly beneath a sky painted with pale shades of blue, gold, and lavender. Long shadows crossed the snow. The surface glittered as if millions of diamonds had been scattered across the landscape. The scene possessed a quiet beauty that photographs could never fully capture. Henry spent the morning exploring the surrounding area. He never traveled far from camp. Safety protocols demanded caution. In an environment this severe, distance could quickly become a problem. Instead, he walked slow circles around the lake, observing patterns in the snow and documenting everything with his camera. Occasionally he stopped simply to appreciate the silence. Back home, silence was rare. Cities hummed constantly. Even rural areas contained distant sounds of vehicles, machinery, or human activity. Here there was nothing. The absence of noise felt almost physical. Around midday he discovered something unexpected. Near a cluster of wind-shaped snow formations he noticed tracks crossing the surface. They appeared fresh. Small but distinct. He crouched to examine them. An Arctic fox. The realization brought a smile. Life existed here after all. Hidden, cautious, and perfectly adapted to conditions that seemed impossible to outsiders. The tracks wandered across the snow before disappearing toward a distant ridge. For the next hour Henry followed them visually through binoculars. Eventually he spotted the animal itself. A tiny white figure moving gracefully against the frozen landscape. It paused briefly, looked toward the horizon, and vanished beyond a drift. The encounter lasted only seconds. Yet it transformed the day. The wilderness no longer felt empty. It felt alive. That evening, after returning to camp, Henry prepared dinner and reviewed the photographs he had taken. The fox appeared in only a few frames, but that was enough. The image reminded him that survival here was not merely possible. Some creatures called this environment home. As darkness settled across the lake, he sat near the tent entrance and looked upward. The stars returned in astonishing numbers. The sky seemed deeper than normal, almost endless. Then a faint green glow appeared near the northern horizon. Henry stared. The glow slowly expanded across the darkness. The northern lights were beginning. The faint green glow that had appeared along the horizon continued to grow until it stretched across a large portion of the sky. Henry remained frozen in place outside the tent, not because of the temperature but because of the spectacle unfolding above him. He had seen photographs of the northern lights throughout his life. He had watched countless videos recorded by travelers and scientists. None of them had prepared him for the real experience. The aurora moved with a slow elegance that felt almost unreal. Curtains of green light drifted across the darkness. Thin ribbons twisted and folded over one another. Occasionally hints of purple appeared near the edges before fading back into green. The entire sky seemed alive. Henry quickly set up his camera and tripod. Even through thick gloves, operating the controls required patience. The cold reduced battery life dramatically, so he worked carefully. Every few minutes he placed spare batteries inside his inner jacket pocket to keep them warm. As the aurora intensified, reflections shimmered across the frozen lake. The ice transformed into a giant mirror that doubled the beauty overhead. Henry captured photograph after photograph, yet he knew the images would only tell part of the story. The true experience included the silence, the cold, the isolation, and the feeling of standing beneath a sky that appeared to move with its own mysterious rhythm. After nearly 2 hours, he finally returned inside the tent. His cheeks tingled from exposure despite his protective gear. He heated water and prepared a hot drink. The warmth spread slowly through his body. While sipping from the insulated cup, he reviewed the photographs. Several images exceeded his expectations. The colors were vivid. The reflections were sharp. The frozen lake had created an extraordinary foreground. Yet what pleased him most was not the technical quality. It was the memory attached to each image. Every frame represented a moment he had personally witnessed in one of the coldest environments on Earth. Before sleeping, Henry recorded another series of voice notes. He spoke about the contrast between hardship and beauty. Many people imagine comfort and beauty existing together. Yet here they often appeared separately. The environment was challenging. Simple tasks required effort. The cold demanded constant attention. Yet because of those difficulties, moments such as the aurora felt even more meaningful. The next morning he awoke to an unfamiliar sound. At first he remained perfectly still inside the sleeping bag. The noise was subtle. A soft brushing against the tent fabric. He listened carefully. The sound appeared again. Something was moving outside. Henry slowly sat up and reached for the zipper. He opened the entrance just enough to look outside. A smile immediately appeared on his face. The visitor was the Arctic fox he had seen the previous day. The small animal stood several meters from the tent. Its thick white fur blended almost perfectly with the snow. It appeared curious rather than frightened. For several seconds the fox studied the tent while Henry studied the fox. Neither moved. Neither seemed eager to end the encounter. Eventually the fox turned its head toward the frozen lake. It paused briefly before trotting away across the snow with effortless grace. Within moments it disappeared into the vast white landscape. Henry watched until the last trace vanished. The encounter left him surprisingly cheerful. Living alone in such isolation could make even a brief glimpse of wildlife feel significant. As the day continued, he focused on exploring a series of low ridges located near the edge of the lake. The terrain offered slightly elevated viewpoints over the surrounding region. From the top of one ridge, he could see endless waves of snow stretching toward distant mountains. The scale of the wilderness became even more apparent from that height. There were no roads. No buildings. No visible signs of civilization. Only ice, snow, sky, and silence extending toward every horizon. Standing there beneath the pale winter sun, Henry experienced a feeling he rarely encountered in everyday life. The constant pressures and distractions of modern routines seemed impossibly distant. Emails did not matter. Deadlines did not matter. Notifications did not matter. The frozen landscape reduced life to simpler priorities. Stay warm. Stay prepared. Observe. Learn. Appreciate. As he began walking back toward camp later that afternoon, the sky slowly shifted into shades of gold and pink. Long shadows stretched across the snow once again. The temperature continued its relentless decline as evening approached. Yet instead of counting the days remaining in the expedition, Henry found himself hoping the experience would slow down. Only 3 days had passed, and already the wilderness was changing the way he viewed time itself. On the 4th day, Henry noticed that his relationship with the cold had begun to change. The temperature remained brutally low, hovering near -50 degrees Celsius, yet the constant shock he had felt during his first hours in the wilderness was gradually fading. The cold was still powerful. It still demanded respect. But it no longer felt like an enemy waiting to punish every mistake. Instead, it had become a permanent feature of the environment, as natural as the snow beneath his boots or the sky above his head. He understood its patterns a little better now. He knew how quickly moisture could freeze. He knew how important it was to manage body heat while moving. He knew which tasks should be completed immediately and which could wait. Experience was replacing uncertainty. After breakfast, he stepped outside and discovered that a gentle wind had arrived during the night. In most places on Earth, the breeze would have seemed insignificant. Here, even a modest wind altered everything. Snow drifted across the surface of the lake in thin streams. Tiny crystals danced through the air and sparkled beneath the pale sunlight. The landscape appeared alive in a new way. Henry spent the morning reinforcing several anchor points around the tent. The structure remained secure, but caution was always worthwhile in remote environments. As he worked, he found himself enjoying the routine. Each task carried purpose. There were no unnecessary activities here. Every action contributed to comfort, safety, or observation. Once the maintenance was complete, he packed a small day bag and headed toward a distant ridge he had been studying through binoculars. The ridge was farther away than his previous excursions, but still within a safe distance from camp. The walk took nearly 2 hours because deep snow covered portions of the route. Along the way, he paused frequently to photograph unusual formations sculpted by wind and cold. Some resembled frozen ocean waves. Others looked like abstract sculptures carved from white stone. Nature had become an artist working with snow instead of paint. When he finally reached the ridge, the view exceeded his expectations. The elevated position revealed a broad valley stretching beyond the frozen lake. In the distance, sunlight reflected from countless ice-covered surfaces. The entire landscape glowed softly beneath the winter sky. Henry sat on an insulated pad and simply observed. Minutes passed. Then nearly an hour. He felt no urge to rush. Back home, stillness often felt unproductive. Here, stillness felt valuable. The wilderness rewarded patience. Subtle details emerged when he allowed himself to remain quiet. He noticed shifting patterns of light across the snow. He observed how distant shadows changed as the sun moved lower. He watched tiny clouds of ice crystals drift through the air like invisible currents becoming briefly visible. During the afternoon, the weather remained stable, but the sky gradually cleared until not a single cloud remained. The horizon appeared sharper than ever. Visibility extended for enormous distances. Henry used the opportunity to capture panoramic photographs and record additional notes for his future article. He spoke about isolation, but not in a negative sense. The isolation here created space for reflection. Without constant interruptions, his thoughts seemed more organized. Problems that had felt complicated before the trip now appeared surprisingly simple. By the time he returned to camp, the sky was beginning its familiar transition toward evening colors. Shades of orange, pink, and violet spread across the horizon. The frozen lake reflected portions of the display, creating the illusion of two skies meeting at the horizon. After preparing dinner, Henry sat inside the tent and reviewed the journal entries he had written since arriving. He was surprised by how much had happened in only a few days. There had been no dramatic events. No emergencies. No extraordinary discoveries. Yet every day felt full. Every observation seemed meaningful. The expedition was teaching him that excitement did not always require constant action. Sometimes the most memorable experiences emerged from careful attention to ordinary moments. Later that night, as darkness settled completely across the wilderness, he stepped outside once more. The stars returned in overwhelming numbers. The air was perfectly clear. The frozen world stretched around him in every direction beneath a sky filled with light. Henry stood there for a long time without speaking. Without taking photographs. Without recording notes. He simply looked upward and appreciated the rare privilege of being present in a place where nature still felt vast beyond comprehension. In that moment, surrounded by snow, ice, and silence, he realized he was no longer counting the remaining days of the expedition. He was already wondering how difficult it would be to leave when the journey finally came to an end. The fifth morning arrived with a sky so clear that the horizon seemed endless. Henry emerged from the tent shortly after waking and immediately noticed how different the landscape appeared beneath the early light. During the night, a thin layer of fresh frost had settled across the snow. Millions of tiny crystals covered the surface like a blanket of glass. Every movement of the sun created new reflections. The frozen lake shimmered with a brilliance that forced him to narrow his eyes despite the low angle of the sunlight. He stood quietly beside the tent for several minutes, breathing slowly and observing the transformation. One of the most surprising lessons of the expedition was how frequently the environment changed even when the weather remained stable. At first glance, the wilderness looked permanent and unchanging. Yet every day revealed new patterns of light, new textures in the snow, and new moods in the sky. After breakfast, Henry decided to spend the day documenting these subtle changes. He packed his camera equipment and began walking along the shoreline of the frozen lake. The surface was solid and stable, but he preferred remaining near the edge where visual landmarks helped maintain orientation. The vast white landscape could sometimes create strange illusions of distance. Objects appeared closer than they actually were. Small hills occasionally looked like distant mountains. The simplicity of the environment challenged the senses in unexpected ways. As he walked, he noticed fresh tracks crossing the snow. They were larger than the fox tracks he had seen earlier in the expedition. Henry crouched to examine them carefully. The impressions were clear and recent. Whatever animal had passed through the area had done so only hours earlier. He followed the trail visually for a short distance before it disappeared over a low rise. Rather than pursue it, he chose to continue with his original plan. Observation felt more important than pursuit. The wilderness offered enough discoveries without forcing them. Throughout the morning, he photographed ice formations along the lake. Some sections contained intricate patterns that looked almost artistic. Thin cracks beneath the transparent surface created geometric designs stretching for several meters. Trapped air bubbles formed vertical chains frozen in place as though time itself had stopped. Henry spent nearly an hour studying one particularly beautiful section of ice. The details seemed endless. Every angle revealed something new. Around midday, he reached a small elevated area overlooking a broad section of the frozen landscape. He sat down to eat lunch and found himself reflecting on how different his daily routine had become. Back home, meals were often rushed. They happened between appointments, deadlines, and obligations. Here, every meal became an event. Preparing food required effort. Water required effort. Warmth required effort. As a result, he appreciated simple comforts more deeply than usual. A hot drink felt luxurious. A warm meal felt memorable. Even sitting inside the shelter of the tent after hours in the cold felt rewarding. During the afternoon, thin clouds began appearing across the sky. They arrived gradually from the west and painted delicate patterns overhead. The changing conditions created dramatic lighting across the snowfields. Shadows deepened. Bright areas glowed more intensely. Henry continued taking photographs until his camera batteries began losing power faster than expected. The cold always won eventually. Returning to camp, he spent several hours organizing equipment and updating his journal. He wrote about the strange effect the wilderness was having on his perception of time. Days felt longer because every activity demanded attention. Yet they also seemed to pass more quickly because each day contained so many observations and experiences. The contradiction fascinated him. As evening approached, the clouds thickened slightly, creating a softer sunset than previous nights. Instead of brilliant colors, the sky displayed gentle shades of silver, blue, and pale gold. The frozen lake reflected the muted tones perfectly. The entire world seemed calm. Later, while preparing dinner, Henry noticed something else. The silence that had once felt unfamiliar now felt comforting. He no longer expected background noise. He no longer searched for distant sounds. The quiet had become part of his daily life. It created room for thoughts that might otherwise remain buried beneath the constant activity of modern living. After eating, he opened the tent entrance and looked outside. Twilight stretched across the landscape. The first stars were beginning to appear. Somewhere beyond the distant ridges, unseen winds moved snow across the wilderness. Somewhere beneath the ice, ancient layers of frozen water rested in complete darkness. The world felt immense and timeless. Henry smiled as he settled into his sleeping bag. 5 days earlier, he had arrived hoping to experience one of the coldest environments on Earth. Instead, he had discovered something unexpected. The expedition was becoming less about surviving extreme temperatures and more about understanding the value of simplicity. In a place with almost nothing, he was somehow finding more than he had expected. The sixth day began beneath a sky filled with thin clouds that glowed softly in the early morning light. Henry unzipped the tent entrance and immediately sensed a subtle difference in the atmosphere. The temperature remained extremely low, but the air felt less sharp than on previous mornings. The change was small, almost impossible to notice without several days of experience in the same environment. Living outdoors had taught him to pay attention to details that would have escaped his notice in ordinary circumstances. The angle of sunlight, the movement of drifting snow, the shape of clouds on the horizon, and even the quality of silence all carried information. After preparing breakfast and melting fresh snow for water, he sat near the entrance of the tent and reviewed his notes. The journal had grown thicker than expected. Every day seemed to provide enough observations for several pages. What surprised him most was not the amount he had written but the topics that filled those pages. He had expected technical notes about equipment and weather. Instead, many entries focused on thoughts, memories, and reflections. The wilderness had created a rare opportunity to think without interruption. Around mid-morning, Henry decided to revisit the ridge where he had spent time several days earlier. The route was now familiar. His footprints had disappeared beneath shifting snow, yet the landmarks remained recognizable. The frozen lake served as a reliable guide. As he walked, he noticed how naturally his body had adapted to the routines of the expedition. Tasks that once required conscious effort now felt automatic. He adjusted clothing layers without hesitation. He monitored energy levels and hydration almost instinctively. The environment had become less intimidating and more understandable. When he reached the ridge, he discovered that the view had changed once again. The cloud cover created dramatic patterns of light across the valley. Wide sections of snow alternated between brightness and shadow. The effect resembled sunlight moving across an enormous white ocean. Henry set up his camera and spent nearly an hour capturing the shifting landscape. Several times he simply lowered the camera and watched. Photography allowed him to preserve moments, but direct observation remained more satisfying. No image could fully reproduce the sensation of standing alone in such a vast place. During lunch, he sat on the sheltered side of the ridge and looked across the horizon. His thoughts drifted toward home. Surprisingly, he did not miss specific conveniences. He missed people. He missed conversations. He missed familiar faces. Yet the feeling was not sadness. Instead, it was appreciation. Distance often revealed the importance of things that daily life encouraged people to take for granted. The expedition was helping him understand that balance mattered. Solitude had value. Connection had value. One became easier to appreciate after experiencing the other. In the afternoon, the clouds gradually broke apart. Patches of blue expanded overhead until most of the sky became clear once more. The sunlight returned with renewed intensity, turning the snow into a field of sparkling crystals. Henry began the walk back toward camp at a relaxed pace. Along the way, he paused frequently to absorb the details around him. The expedition was already more than halfway complete. The realization felt strange. The days had passed quickly, yet each one remained vivid in his memory. Back at camp, he spent time inspecting equipment and preparing supplies for the remaining days. Everything remained in excellent condition. The tent had endured the cold without issue. The stove continued functioning reliably. Food supplies were exactly where they needed to be. Careful preparation before the journey was proving worthwhile. As evening approached, the sky transformed into layers of gold and rose-colored light. Henry stood near the frozen shoreline and watched the sunset unfold across the wilderness. The scene felt peaceful in a way that was difficult to describe. There was no audience. No schedule. No expectation. The beauty existed whether anyone observed it or not. That thought stayed with him as darkness settled over the landscape. Later, inside the tent, he read through portions of his journal before sleeping. One sentence caught his attention. He had written it on the first night after arriving. The entry described uncertainty about spending 10 days in such isolation. Henry smiled when he read those words. The uncertainty felt distant now. The wilderness no longer seemed unfamiliar. It felt like a temporary home. As he switched off his headlamp and settled into the warmth of his sleeping bag, he listened to the quiet sounds of the frozen world outside. The occasional movement of distant ice echoed faintly across the lake. Beyond that, there was only silence. It was the kind of silence that did not feel empty. It felt full of space, possibility, and perspective. Before sleep finally arrived, Henry found himself wondering how the expedition would change him after he returned home. He suspected the answer would take time to understand. Some journeys revealed their meaning only after they ended. The seventh morning arrived with a brilliant display of sunlight reflecting across the frozen lake. Henry woke earlier than usual and immediately sensed an unusual energy. Perhaps it was because the expedition had entered its final phase. Perhaps it was because the weather conditions were nearly perfect. Or perhaps it was simply the result of spending nearly a week surrounded by a landscape that encouraged awareness. Whatever the reason, he felt eager to begin the day. After breakfast, he stepped outside and paused as he often did. The habit had developed naturally during the trip. Before any task, before any plan, he spent a few moments observing the environment. The sky was clear. The air was still. The distant ridges stood sharply against the horizon. Everything appeared calm. Yet Henry had learned that calm conditions often revealed details hidden by movement and weather. He packed a small bag and set out toward a section of the frozen lake he had not yet explored. The route crossed a broad expanse of snow that stretched for several kilometers. Walking through such an open landscape produced a curious sensation. Without trees, buildings, or other familiar reference points, distance became difficult to judge. A ridge that appeared nearby might require an hour to reach. A small feature on the horizon could turn out to be much larger than expected. The wilderness constantly reminded him that human perception had limits. As he walked, sunlight illuminated countless crystals scattered across the snow. The surface sparkled continuously. It looked as though the entire landscape had been dusted with tiny fragments of glass. Each step produced a crisp crunch beneath his boots. Beyond that sound, silence dominated everything. Around midday, Henry reached a gently elevated area near the center of the lake. From there, he could see in every direction without obstruction. The view was extraordinary. Endless white terrain merged with the pale blue horizon. Above, the sky appeared impossibly vast. He stood quietly and slowly turned in a complete circle. There was no evidence of roads. No power lines. No aircraft. No signs of modern life. The scene could have belonged to any century. For a moment, he imagined how early explorers must have felt when encountering landscapes like this. They traveled without satellite communication, modern clothing, or detailed weather forecasts. The thought increased his appreciation for both their courage and the technology that made his own journey safer. Henry remained there for nearly an hour. He took photographs, recorded notes, and occasionally sat in silence simply to observe. During one of those quiet moments, he noticed movement in the distance. At first, he assumed it was drifting snow. Then the shape became clearer through his binoculars. A small group of animals moved slowly across a far section of the landscape. They were too distant for precise identification, but their presence filled him with excitement. Life continued to thrive here despite conditions that seemed impossible. The wilderness was not empty. It was simply subtle. Its inhabitants had learned to exist without drawing attention to themselves. The sight reminded Henry of a lesson he had encountered repeatedly throughout the expedition. Important things were often easy to miss when moving too quickly. In cities, people rushed from one obligation to another. Here, patience revealed details that haste would overlook. By late afternoon, he began the return journey. Long shadows stretched across the snow as the sun lowered toward the horizon. The changing light transformed familiar terrain into something entirely new. Every ridge and drift seemed sculpted by gold and silver. The landscape looked less like a frozen wilderness and more like a giant work of art. Back at camp, Henry prepared dinner while reviewing photographs from the day. Several images captured the immense scale of the environment particularly well. Looking at them, he realized that the photographs would serve as reminders, but not replacements. The most meaningful part of the experience could not be stored on a memory card. It existed in the sensations, thoughts, and emotions attached to each moment. After eating, he stepped outside one final time before sleep. The sky was beginning to darken. Stars emerged gradually above the frozen lake. A faint green glow appeared near the northern horizon, suggesting that the aurora might return later in the night. Henry smiled. The wilderness seemed determined to offer another gift. Standing there beneath the growing darkness, he became aware of how much the expedition had changed his daily perspective. The things that mattered here were simple: warmth, shelter, preparation, observation, gratitude. Stripped of distractions, those priorities appeared remarkably clear. As he returned to the tent and settled into his sleeping bag, he realized that only a few days remained before the journey would end. The thought brought mixed emotions. He looked forward to returning home and sharing his experiences. Yet part of him already knew that he would miss this frozen world. The silence, the vastness, and the simplicity had become companions. And like all meaningful companions, they would be difficult to leave behind. Later that night, Henry woke unexpectedly and noticed a faint green glow filtering through the fabric of the tent. For a moment he remained inside his sleeping bag, wondering if he was imagining it. Then curiosity won. He pulled on additional layers, unzipped the entrance, and stepped into the freezing darkness. The sight above him immediately erased any trace of sleep. The aurora had returned, and it was far more powerful than during his earlier encounter. Vast curtains of green light stretched across the sky from horizon to horizon. Waves of color rippled overhead with graceful motion. At times the light seemed to drift slowly like clouds. Moments later they would brighten and twist into intricate patterns that appeared almost alive. Henry stood motionless, completely absorbed by the display. The frozen lake reflected the shifting colors, creating the illusion that the sky existed both above and below him. It felt as though he were standing between two worlds made of light. He eventually remembered to retrieve his camera, but even while photographing the aurora he found himself lowering the equipment repeatedly. Some experiences deserved direct attention. The northern lights were one of them. Nearly 2 hours passed before the display finally began to fade. By the time Henry returned to the tent, he felt both exhausted and energized. Sleep came slowly. His mind continued replaying the images he had witnessed. When morning arrived, he discovered that he had slept later than usual. The sun was already illuminating portions of the landscape with soft golden light. After breakfast, he sat outside the tent holding a warm drink and reflecting on the previous night. The aurora had reminded him how unpredictable and generous nature could be. No schedule had guaranteed the display. No plan had created it. The experience had arrived unexpectedly, rewarding patience and presence. Throughout the day, Henry remained close to camp. Rather than exploring new areas, he focused on appreciating the surroundings he had come to know so well. He walked along familiar sections of the frozen shoreline. He revisited viewpoints he had photographed earlier in the expedition. He spent time simply observing how light moved across the snow. Returning to these locations felt different now. During his first days, he had viewed them as discoveries. Now they felt almost familiar. The wilderness had transformed from an unknown environment into a place filled with personal memories. At midday, he sat near a low ridge overlooking the lake and opened his journal. Reading through the previous entries created a strange sensation. The first pages belonged to a version of himself that already seemed distant. Those early notes contained uncertainty, caution, and curiosity. The later entries reflected confidence, appreciation, and a deeper understanding of the environment. The landscape had not changed dramatically during the expedition. He had. Henry spent several hours writing. He described the silence that seemed impossible to find elsewhere. He described the beauty of extreme simplicity. He described how quickly modern concerns lost their importance when confronted by a world governed by snow, ice, weather, and daylight. Most importantly, he wrote about attention. The wilderness rewarded attention more than anything else. The more carefully he observed, the richer the experience became. During the afternoon, clouds appeared briefly along the horizon before dissolving into the clear sky. The weather remained calm. The frozen lake stretched outward in every direction, unchanged and timeless. Yet Henry knew his time there was becoming limited. Only 2 days remained before he would begin the journey back to civilization. Surprisingly, the realization no longer carried sadness. Instead, it brought gratitude. The expedition had already given him far more than he expected. He had arrived seeking adventure. He had found perspective. As evening approached, the sunset painted the landscape with extraordinary colors. Shades of amber, rose, and violet spread across the horizon and reflected from the snow. Henry watched the transformation from outside the tent. The scene unfolded slowly, encouraging patience. There was no need to hurry. No reason to check the time. Nature followed its own schedule. After darkness arrived, he prepared dinner and organized equipment for the days ahead. The routine felt familiar and comforting. Every item had its place. Every task had purpose. Before sleeping, he stepped outside once more. The stars filled the sky in astonishing numbers. Their light seemed sharper here, untouched by artificial illumination. Henry looked upward and felt the same sense of wonder that had greeted him on his first night. Yet now the feeling carried something extra. Familiarity had not diminished the beauty. It had deepened it. The wilderness no longer impressed him merely because it was different. It impressed him because he had taken the time to understand it. Standing alone beside the tent beneath the vast northern sky, Henry realized that the most valuable part of any journey was not reaching a destination. It was learning how to truly see the place where you had arrived. The ninth day began with a realization that followed Henry from the moment he opened his eyes. Tomorrow would be his final full day in the wilderness. The thought lingered as he prepared breakfast and completed the familiar morning routine. Only a short time remained before he would pack his equipment, leave the frozen lake behind, and return to the noise and movement of ordinary life. A week earlier, that prospect would have sounded comforting. Now it felt surprisingly complicated. He missed home, yet he knew he would miss this place as well. The wilderness had become more than a destination. It had become an experience woven into his daily rhythm. After breakfast, Henry stepped outside and looked across the lake. The weather was nearly perfect. The sky remained clear, and sunlight illuminated the snow with remarkable clarity. It seemed as though the landscape had decided to offer one final stretch of beautiful conditions before his departure. Rather than choosing a specific objective for the day, he decided to wander slowly through areas he had already explored. There was no urgency to discover something new. Instead, he wanted to revisit the places that had shaped the journey. He walked first toward the ridge where he had spent hours observing the valley. The route felt familiar now. Landmarks that once required careful attention had become recognizable companions. The frozen shoreline curved exactly as he remembered. The distant hills stood in their usual positions beneath the pale sky. Even the subtle contours of the snow appeared familiar. Reaching the ridge, he sat quietly and looked across the landscape. The view remained magnificent. Yet what struck him most was how differently he perceived it now. During the first days, the wilderness had seemed vast because it was unknown. Now it felt vast because he understood a little more about it. Knowledge had not reduced its scale. It had increased his appreciation. Henry spent nearly an hour there before continuing his walk. Along the way, he encountered fresh animal tracks once again. The impressions crossed the snow in a winding path before disappearing over a rise. He smiled at the sight. Throughout the expedition, these occasional reminders of hidden wildlife had added depth to the experience. Life existed everywhere, even when it remained unseen. The wilderness revealed only a small portion of its stories to casual observers. During the afternoon, Henry reached a section of the frozen lake where transparent ice was visible beneath a thin layer of snow. He carefully brushed away several patches and examined the patterns below. Air bubbles remained suspended deep within the ice. Thin lines created natural designs resembling maps, rivers, and branching trees. The details fascinated him. He found himself wondering how many people had ever stopped to study these small features. Most visitors probably focused on larger views and dramatic moments. Yet some of the expedition's most memorable discoveries had been tiny details hidden in plain sight. Hours passed almost unnoticed. The sun gradually moved lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the landscape. Henry realized that the expedition had altered his relationship with time. Back home, he often measured days through tasks completed and obligations fulfilled. Here, time felt connected to observation. A day felt meaningful not because of productivity but because of attention. The distinction seemed important. As evening approached, he returned to camp and prepared dinner. The tent felt warmer and more welcoming than ever. Every corner contained reminders of the previous days. The sleeping bag where he had rested after long walks. The journal filled with observations and reflections. The camera equipment that had captured thousands of images. The stove that had transformed snow into water every single day. Ordinary objects had become part of a larger story. After eating, Henry spent time reviewing photographs from the entire expedition. Image after image appeared on the screen. Sunsets. Snowfields. Ice formations. The fox. The aurora. The frozen lake beneath countless stars. Together, the photographs formed a visual record of the journey. Yet he knew they represented only fragments. The cold, the silence, the stillness, and the emotions attached to each moment existed beyond what any camera could preserve. Darkness eventually settled across the wilderness. Henry stepped outside for what might be one of his final nights beneath the northern sky. The stars appeared almost immediately. The air was calm. The landscape rested beneath a blanket of silver moonlight. Everything felt peaceful. Standing there, he reflected on the goals he had carried into the expedition. He had hoped to challenge himself. He had hoped to experience one of the harshest climates on Earth. He had hoped to gather material for an article. All of those goals had been achieved. Yet the most important outcome had never appeared on his original list. The journey had reminded him of something simple and easily forgotten. A meaningful life was not measured only by what a person accomplished. It was also measured by what they noticed, appreciated, and remembered. With that thought lingering in his mind, Henry returned to the tent and prepared for sleep. One final day remained. He intended to make the most of every moment. The final morning arrived quietly. Henry opened his eyes and lay still for several moments, listening to the familiar silence surrounding the tent. For 9 days, that silence had been a constant companion. At first it had felt unusual. Later it had become comforting. Now, knowing he would soon leave, it felt valuable. He checked the thermometer one last time. The temperature remained close to -50 degrees Celsius. The wilderness had not changed its nature simply because his journey was ending. The cold remained powerful. The frozen lake remained endless. The northern sky remained vast. Yet Henry knew he would remember this morning differently from all the others. After breakfast, he stepped outside and slowly looked around the camp. The tent stood exactly where he had assembled it on the first day. The surrounding snow carried traces of the routines that had shaped his time here. There were paths leading toward the lake. Small areas where he had stood to photograph sunsets. Sections where equipment had been stored temporarily during daily tasks. Individually, none of these details seemed important. Together, they represented 10 days of life in one of the coldest environments he had ever experienced. Rather than rushing to begin packing, Henry decided to spend his final day appreciating the landscape one last time. He walked along the frozen shoreline at a relaxed pace. The sky was perfectly clear. Sunlight illuminated the snowfields with remarkable brilliance. Every crystal sparkled beneath the pale winter sun. The world appeared almost unreal in its beauty. Reaching a familiar ridge, he stopped and sat down. The view stretched outward exactly as it had on previous days. Yet now he observed it with a different perspective. The wilderness no longer felt like a place he was visiting. It felt like a place that had welcomed him temporarily before allowing him to move on. He spent hours there, alternating between writing, photographing, and simply looking. There was nothing left to accomplish. No hidden destination remained. No final challenge awaited him. The value of the day existed entirely in presence. During the afternoon, Henry returned to camp and began organizing equipment for departure. Sleeping gear was packed carefully. Cameras were secured. Supplies were inventoried. The routine felt almost automatic after so many days. As he worked, he found himself smiling occasionally at unexpected memories. The first aurora. The fox crossing the snow. The endless stars. The shifting colors of distant sunsets. The countless moments of silence that had gradually become meaningful. Each memory felt vivid. As evening approached, the sky produced one final display of color. Shades of gold, orange, pink, and violet spread across the horizon. The frozen lake reflected the light perfectly. Henry stood beside the tent and watched without taking photographs. He had already captured enough images. This moment belonged entirely to memory. The sunset faded slowly. Twilight arrived. Then darkness settled across the wilderness for the final time. Above him, thousands of stars emerged once more. Henry remained outside for nearly an hour, absorbing every detail he could. The cold pressed against his clothing. The snow reflected faint starlight. The horizon stretched endlessly into darkness. Everything felt peaceful. Eventually he returned to the tent and settled into his sleeping bag for the last night. Sleep did not come immediately. Instead, he reflected on everything the expedition had taught him. He had learned practical lessons about surviving extreme cold. He had learned how important preparation could be. He had learned to respect environments that operated according to their own rules. Yet the most important lessons had nothing to do with weather or equipment. He had learned the value of slowing down. He had learned the importance of attention. He had learned that silence was not the absence of something but the presence of space. Space to think. Space to observe. Space to appreciate. The next morning, Henry packed the final items, dismantled the tent, and loaded the sled. The process felt strangely emotional. Within a few hours, there would be no visible sign that he had ever been there. The snow would eventually erase his tracks. The wind would smooth the surface. The wilderness would continue exactly as before. Standing beside the frozen lake one final time, he looked across the endless white horizon and took a long breath. He realized that the expedition had never really been about camping at -50 degrees. The temperature had been the reason he came. It was not the reason the journey mattered. The true value had been found in the moments between the challenges. In the quiet observations. In the changing light. In the stars above the ice. In the realization that simplicity often reveals what constant activity hides. With a final glance toward the lake, Henry turned and began the journey home. The frozen wilderness slowly receded behind him. Yet he knew something important. Although he was leaving the landscape, part of the landscape would travel with him. The silence, the perspective, and the memories would remain long after the snow disappeared from view. And whenever life became crowded with noise and urgency again, he would remember the days he spent beneath the northern sky, living in a small tent at -50 degrees, discovering that sometimes the coldest places can leave the warmest impressions.